Hello and welcome to another episode of A Coffee with Chris, the social media show that helps you create impact. As always, brought to you in association with our wonderful charity partners, Big C, who help local people affected by cancer, and Blue Bear Coffee, replacing your business's coffee to help children that have experienced human trafficking. Today, as always, I am sipping on Blue Bear coffee, and I have been consuming a lot of their Indonesia blend, which is absolutely delicious. And of course, as well as our charity partners, we're very proud that this podcast is sponsored by Oliver Hill of Hill Coaching Company, Limitless Film and Media, Mindset HR, and Wingfield Consultants. That's the formalities out of the way. Let's welcome today's guest. I'm fascinated by this one, and I cannot wait to get into the conversation. I am delighted to be joined by consumer psychologist Babs Crane. Babs specializes in bringing human understanding to communications, design, and technology. Babs, as always on this show, we like to kick off with the why. You specialize in understanding what makes people tick, essentially. And when it comes to social media, this is so important, right? So what do businesses often get wrong when it comes to human behavior, full stop, and perhaps how that kind of transfers into social media?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it is like a general thing. And I think there's quite a few things that we get wrong. I'll use some air quotes for that because we're not necessarily getting things wrong, but human beings don't think and behave in quite the way that we think they think. Like there's that. We're all humans, right? So I hope anyway, like everyone watching this is a human being. We've all got our experience of everything that we encounter in life and everything that we do. But one of the most fascinating things about psychology is how you understand how people do think in a very different way to how we assume they do. And in fact, this is the thing that kind of got me into this to begin with when I first set out in this career, because back in my early career I didn't have a degree in this or 2 degrees in this. I was working in a sales role, and I was finding even just doing that and doing business development and some marketing stuff nearly 20 years ago now, people were behaving quite differently and responding quite differently to messages, and relationships were developing quite differently based on quite small differences in the way that either messages were framed or the way things were presented. And I was absolutely fascinated by it. And I could see quite easily then that some of the tried and tested methods weren't necessarily garnering the kind of responses that you would have thought they would have done, and something a little bit different, quite a small change, but actually ended up having quite a significantly bigger impact. So if I can encapsulate the question as to what do you think businesses get wrong, and yes, about social media, but actually broadly about any kind of communication we put out there, we are sometimes designing it, crafting it in a way where we think people are going to process all of this information we're giving them, and as marketers, which, broadly speaking, this is the audience, right? So I think we as human beings feel much more comfortable and reassured if we are kind of throwing the kitchen sink at everything, and if we are giving people all the information so they can make an informed decision about something like that. That feels like by far the best option to do. Give them everything so they can sit there and really decide what's best for them. But actually, when you start studying how our brains process information, they don't work through things in that kind of nice methodical way that you would hope that they would do, and a lot of people assume they do. So yeah, that's definitely the biggest thing that has been identified and continues to be identified, I think, in the industry.
What a way to kick things off, Babs. So interesting. There are so many corners that we could deep dive into today. But one of the things that we keep interest about yourself, Babs, and kind of what you do and your skill set is you have this three-tiered approach to behavioral science in business, right? And the first step is creating the message. And of course, when it comes to social media, this is so important. What psychological principles should businesses consider when crafting social media content that truly connects?
Yeah, so going back to the point about there is this real tendency for us to put a lot of information out there. Like one of the big psychological principles that has a really big impact on whether people are going to process information and therefore connect with it is this principle that's called cognitive fluency or processing fluency. And that's ultimately how easy it is for us to process the information that's being presented to us. So just to kind of give you a little bit of a background on where this comes from, we all, if I was to ask you, how do you make a decision? How do you make your decisions? And this is a question, if I've done workshops with people, training sessions with people, it's a question I often pose to people as part of that. And most people will say, well, look, I drew up a pros and cons list. I'll work through this. I'll weigh up, cost benefit analyses, things like that happen all the time in business. But actually, if you actually stop and think about how many decisions our brain is making on a daily basis, it can go into it does go into the tens of thousands. So things that you don't necessarily consider would be a decision is still a decision in our brains. So we have evolved to be really efficient in the way that we make these decisions and the way we process information that's presented to us. If anybody watching has ever encountered the world of behavioural science, it's a discipline and it's definitely become much more prominent in so many different industries in the last decade, 15 years or so. They may well have heard the term that we are lazy, that our brains don't like thinking because we're basically lazy and we don't like doing it. But actually, it's a nuanced point, but I will make it, and I always make it. We're not necessarily lazy. We've evolved to be really efficient, because if we had to process every decision that we make, because there's tens of thousands every day, we wouldn't be able to function and in the way that we function now. We just could not do it. So our brains have evolved to work in a really efficient way, but because of that feature, that means that we rely quite a lot on quick rules of thumbs, shortcuts, which generally speaking serve us quite well. They are the things that enable us to be able to navigate through any communication that we receive, navigate through life, interact with other people. We just are constantly making these very quick judgments about things and kind of a bit of a finger in the air, but we don't necessarily know all the time that that's what we're doing. Sometimes we're well aware of the fact that we've just kind of put a finger in the air about a decision, but actually our brains are doing a lot of this stuff under the level of conscious awareness. So we need to be able to design our messages to speak to that type of processing that our brain does, rather than the really detailed methodical processing that, yes, it does do. And we can all think about a time when, if we've made a decision about something, we've done a pros and cons list, or we've gone through certain frameworks like a cost benefit analysis or whatever it might be to make a decision. But those decisions that we're making using those methods are actually quite few and far between. And this very automatic processing is driving a lot of our decision making. So that's why it's really important to think about, when you're crafting any kind of message, how we can craft it for that type of processing first. And one of the biggest things that we can think about is, as I said earlier on, how easy is it for people to process this information? One of the things that can have a big impact on that is not necessarily the message itself, but actually thinking about who is the messenger, like what is the form of that delivery, because actually that can have quite a big impact on whether or not that really connects with an audience, if that really connects with a viewer. And actually if the messenger, and when I say this, so it could be if you're trying to deliver a particular message where people are quite unsure, or they might be quite unsure about whatever it is, you're communicating, which is often the case. Sometimes actually having that message framed as if it's been delivered by, or not as if it's been delivered, but if it's being delivered by somebody who is in the position of authority, can have a disproportionate effect on whether or not that then connects with somebody. And the good old faithful social proof is a hugely influential piece on whether or not a message is going to really connect with people. Another thing as well, so helping with like how well we process things. One of like a really nice little technique that is used, I think, quite sparingly, and when it's used, it can be really useful. And there are many studies that back this up from the world of psychology. It's actually just using like a rhyme. If you can create a message that rhymes, there have been studies looking at, do people perceive a particular message to be more truthful if it rhymes or not? And there's been studies where they have like exactly the same outcome of a message. And in fact, I think I've got it written down here. Let me see if I can get it up so I can actually give you the
whilst you get that up, Babs, I did not have you talking about rhyming on my bingo podcast. That's so interesting. I think there's so many dovetails here. This could go into language, or very much goes into language, doesn't it? Speaking to your audience. It goes into the human brain making decisions emotionally first and logically second. It goes into so many things, isn't it? But rhyming, talk to me about that one then.
Yeah, so I know, and because of course we see it. I mean, we see it in slogans and taglines. But yeah, so psychologists have run studies into this to say, okay, like what do people perceive to be more believable? And there's been a few, but one of the ones which I now have in front of me, they basically gave people two options, or they split a group of people into two groups, and they basically said, right, here's a statement, and this one says, caution and measure will win you riches. And then there's the other statement that says, caution and measure will win you treasure.
Yeah.
And they were then asked to just do a quick judgment, which one's more true, like which one's more believable. And the rhyming one was more believable. And they've done it with similar things where you ultimately say the same thing, but the rhyming one is perceived to be more truthful and more believable. And that just comes back to that process influency piece. So the fact that it just makes it a bit more memorable. It's easier just to kind of see where just that sentence is going, and our brains just process that a little bit easier, and that then feels more trustworthy and more believable to us, just in that quick judgment that we're making.
Well, if our growing community take nothing else away from this conversation, it's just rhymes all over your market. I think that's so interesting, Babs. Thank you for sharing that insight. Do you know the thing that really pops up in my head now, Babs, is I automatically go into social media geek mode, right? And I'm starting to think about what are the types of content that in your very, very qualified opinion would work best for, I would say, maybe pushing people further down the funnel, or pulling people further down the funnel, or whichever word you like to use. Essentially, what are the types of content that would connect to consumer psychology in order to drive revenue? Because there's this ongoing debate, for example, about copy versus creative. video? Is it yourself? Is it just the words? Is it short and snackable? Is it long form? Sorry, I'm throwing loads into. I'm just so excited. Tell me all the things.
Tell me everything. Well, so one thing I will say is that anything human behaviour related, I'm sure we can all appreciate. Everybody is different, so there isn't like a perfect silver bullet. And this is why, just to get a little bit geeky about it for a split second, but like this is why it is really, really important to kind of know a bit about this, but also to be able to test it in a proper way, because every audience is different. So one of the things that can be really useful is understanding your audience. Hey, we all know that that's important, but actually understanding something about their psychology, and a really a very interesting area, and an area that's quite popular within the psychology community, is personality science and personality traits. And actually just understanding, like being able to segment an audience in that just defines a bit more about their prevalent personality traits, because we know that we are all cognitive misers. So that's kind of like a widely accepted rule. So when I say cognitive misers, sorry, that's a psychological theory, but that's that whole principle that we are making a lot of quick automatic judgments on things all the time. So we've evolved to kind of be like that. So that's kind of there. But there are always differences across an audience. That all kind of comes back into that, those quick judgments. Some people are much more motivated by a message, for example, that will. So, sorry, just to pause and go back slightly, but we as marketers, we often put messages out that are like highly aspirational, and like whether it's copy, whether it's creative. Like the messaging that goes out is like, right, this is what you're going to get, you know, like this is for you, you're going to get this is it's very like positive, aspirational, completely makes sense as to why we would be going out with messaging like that. However, there's a big chunk of most audiences, and of course each business's audience will vary, and there are certain sectors where you might find that there's a higher proportion of these people. And these are the people that actually, whether they know it or not, they are looking to be reassured that they're not making a bad decision first, before their brains would even kind of then start being receptive to the really aspirational messaging. There are other people that actually the aspirational messaging of like, you're going to get this is amazing, this is like exciting, all those, that kind of framing of a message that will resonate with them a lot more sooner. So one of the things you can do, obviously, to be really geeky about it, which is where I very much like to be, you know, like it's actually starting to understand, you know, who in our audience, you know, are quite high on certain personality traits. So like, for example, somebody who's quite high in extroversion probably would respond a little bit sooner to that real aspirational messaging and the exciting imagery and like social connection imagery, you know, like that kind of stuff where, you know, you're in a group, you're people with like high openness to experience, which is another personality trait. They would respond typically really well to imagery that reflects big social events, like big gigs. It depends on obviously what, you know, what industry you're in, but something like that. Whereas actually people who are lower on those traits would prefer imagery that maybe just is a bit more like self-reflective and slightly more solitary, but still promoting like the same product or service. So it's kind of, it's starting to understand some of these personality traits of the audience that can be really, really useful. But another technique that's also really good with regards to moving people through the funnel and moving people onto some kind of conversion point is actually getting some micro commitments along the way. So like just having some like small decision points, and maybe being able to reassure them with a piece of social proof or something like that in that timely moment when they're going to be just presented with a small decision. So it's not like the big conversion piece, it's not like the big buy now, or like the big event that we need to happen, but actually just asking a small commitment along the way can then make it more likely that people stick with you and go through the further down the funnel when you can convert them.
Huge advocate of social proof, Babs. So I'm delighted that you've said that. It's a key component part of almost every single one of our client strategies for their social media content. I think it's so important to do. The other thing I want to get your take on, Babs, not in the show notes, so get ready for this. From your perspective, what's your opinion on more of the pain point side of things? So you've delved into the world of aspirational content, and you can get, but what about driving people by, if you don't do this, you're going to be there? Is that something that you should push across your messaging? Is that something that you would advocate?
Yes, is a very short answer, and then I will elaborate on. Yes, so the basic that can be really, really powerful with regards to influencing some kind of behavior. There are two big caveats to this. So actually, arguably, it can be more influential for certain audiences. Like I said, like so many people want the reassurance that they're not making a bad decision, and that kind of motivation comes back to a psychological principle which is known as loss aversion. And this is basically this, for a starter, this particular area of psychology, and the researchers that are really widely published on studies around loss aversion won a Nobel Prize for like their work in this. And this is one of the things that I think really made a lot of the economics world and community prick their ears up to how actually humans behave in a way that we probably didn't think they would be. And it explains why certain strategies don't work or hadn't worked previously. But basically, loss aversion is this principle that instead of, as humans, there was a widely accepted assumption that we're all just kind of in it for ourselves, and we just want to get as many things as possible. And that's why obviously all this aspirational messaging has been really popular. And it does work, like I say, it does work. But actually, psychologically, we feel the pain of a loss far more deeply than the equivalent gain. So, and we then go out of our way to avoid losing something. So when people are there and say that if you're trying to change them, like switch them to your product, your service, whatever it might be, there is so much inertia there, and we all pull our hair out because we're thinking, well, we just really want, why are they not doing this? It's a much better product. We've given them all the benefits. We can why are they not switching? A lot of the time, they are just worried about being in a far worse position by switching, because you feel that fear of a potential loss of something far greater than an equivalent gain. So actually framing a message with regards to, okay, this is kind of what you stand to lose if you don't choose to do this particular thing, if you don't switch, can be really, really powerful. And that really taps into that driver of loss aversion. It's this thing that really does drive a lot of human behavior. But obviously it's making sure that what you're saying is true and it is right. And, because it can be a really powerful thing. And actually, if you do manage to get somebody to switch, and maybe the product, service, whatever it is, isn't as they thought, then that can have an even bigger negative effects in the long run. So that can be much more damaging because it is such a big psychological pull.
I think well, thank you for being really, really transparent there, actually, because it's all very well and good us coming on and talking shop about all of these things that you can do without presenting the risks. So I appreciate the fact that you just go too far with that loss piece there. I think it's so important. So many people that come our way for social coaching, consultancy, management, Babs, often all of their messaging is that aspirational world of all the things that it's lovely and it's fluffy and it's positive, and that's great. And I'm that person, right? But actually, tapping into that loss aversion piece there, I think is something that a lot of businesses should try in 2025 if they've not already. And speaking of a year and moving forwards now, Babs, I really want to ask you about the future, really, because social media platforms are constantly evolving, right? It's why my hairline is going back at quite the lot. But human psychology, it always stays the same, Babs. And so I want to ask you, when it comes to behavioral science, and I guess shaping the future of digital marketing and online engagement, what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, isn't it? I'm with you, because I also, sit chasing the algorithm as much as anyone else, trying to think, what have they changed now? It is really interesting, and I'm really pleased you made that point, because this is something that when, especially a few years ago, when I came out of, I did a master's degree in consumer psychology, and I mean, I say a few years ago, we're coming on for nearly 10 years, but when I first came out of that, people just didn't quite understand, I suppose, kind of like, why, like, what is it? Because it's not massively big as an area in the UK, but it is quite unsurprisingly huge in the US. But in the UK, there aren't that many consumer psychologists working. There are a nice handful, but not in the thousands that are in the US. But one of the things that when I first started talking about how important it is to like marry the worlds of psychology, communication, design, I've worked a lot in technology and design, still do. It is that point. It's like, actually, because everyone's talking about technology, everyone's talking about technological development, and this is before the big AI boom, but obviously that's now happened as well. So it just reinforces that even more. But it's like, look, at the end of the day, every business is owned by, run by, operated by humans for humans, and technology is built by humans for humans. Like, we have, where there are humans, there's a real need to understand humans. And like you say, our psychology, like the way our brains work, evolves, like a really, really slow pace. And technology just in the last 5 years, last 2 years, has just like propelled across. And I think this is something that we're really seeing a lot of, especially in like your social media content generation. I'm certainly seeing this. There's a real homogenization of the type of content, because people are using generative AI tools, and like, great, it is brilliant at augmenting and supporting. I use AI, like everyone uses it, but I do think so. In order to have the real psychological connection that we know drives so much of like business outcomes, ultimately, like this is ultimately what it comes down to. I think like the real differentiator is going to be using those tools, but actually understanding how people are going to perceive, how they're going to be received, in order to stand out, because it is that human connection. And there are like brain imaging studies that show what happens in the brain when people are presented with a brand that their preferred brand versus their second favorite brand, or a competitor brands, and just how different areas of the brain are active and how they process that. So if we're all using like the similar tools and we're not refining it to our brand tone of voice or whatever it is, I think like the future is going to be much more about, right, we're all going to be on a similar footing with regards to the technology use, and it's going to go back to the differentiation piece, and hopefully some like much more personalization.
Yes.
Which, again, buzzword, we all know talk about personalization, but personalization on a deeper level with something that is actually genuinely useful. And that's the thing. It's because one thing I will say about anything with regards to psychological approaches, and we kind of like briefly touched on it earlier on, was how if people feel like they are they're out of control of their decision making. You know, like if you feel like you're being pushed into a certain direction, and like maybe I was going to mention it on the 𝗖𝗵𝗿𝗀𝗲 framing of the messages, if it feels like you're losing your sense of agency over your decision making, then people react, and they react negatively. And there is a thing called reactance, and that basically means that people are then far less likely to make that decision than before. So you can't force people into a certain, you know, through a certain journey and force them into certain decisions that aren't right for them. So I think a lot of technology is making things really efficient and very easy, which is fantastic, and it's given us a good kicking off point. But I do think that the future is for it to be successful, for businesses to be successful with their messaging, I think actually getting to connect on that level.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I think that is a great answer, Babs, in quite some depth, actually. I think there's almost like, it's almost like the unsexy truth, right? Everyone's talking about AI and, you know, technology and things like that. It's almost like we need to make sure that our ground floor is fully established, right? And that's understanding consumer psychology. It's understanding our market segmentation and who we're going after and their personality. I think that personality piece you said at the start of the conversation is so good as well, because it's not just their interests and their behaviors, it's also their personality types, and so many businesses think about that. So I think that's gold, and I love the truth behind that. But Babs, I want to come to you now on some of the you might maybe brand it or you know, quote unquote call it mistakes that you see businesses, brands make when it comes to social media specifically, and you're scrolling through LinkedIn, for example. What are some of the things that you see? It must do your head in, actually, pardon the pun, and you must look at it and go, oh my God, if only you did this, you changed that to that. And you know, what are the mistakes that you see that you would recommend that businesses avoid at all costs when it comes to, you know, getting into this world that you're in?
Yeah, yes, I do bang my head against the wall sometimes, but no one's perfect either. And look, we're all just everyone's trying to make a good impact, so there's absolutely no judgment here. However, and I will probably focus more on LinkedIn, because that is literally where I spend most of my time when it comes to social media. But I think the real thing that I see so many times, and it's kind of the reason why I brought it to the forefront of the conversation today, is the process influency piece. So the fact that, and especially on LinkedIn, I think especially in the B2B world, and I work primarily in B2B, so there is that real want to just get so much information over, and it is let's help people make an informed decision, so let's give them everything. And it's not the way our brains process information. Like, we can, but we don't like to. And one of the famous psychologists one of the ones that won the Nobel Prize, that has dictated so much work in this area, he came out with a quote, and I'm going to butcher this now, but it's basically saying, thinking to humans is like swimming is to cats. They can do it, but they don't like it. And it's it does kind of like conceptualize it. We do think, of course we do, and we do focus work, and we do process a lot of information, but there's an awful lot of processing that happens below that level of conscious awareness. And so when you're scrolling through feeds, you see so much information, and there are just ways that you can still present that level of information, because especially in the B2B world, you do still need to give over a lot of information, but you can present it in a way that's much more brain friendly, and you can also present it in a way that helps just to bolster people's perceptions of your company. So it helps just to so that in the B2B world, there's that propensity to get a lot of information over, really just like get your competence over, and only that. So it's quite dry, and it's very technical, and it's very detailed. But actually, we know that even in the B2B space, because we're all just still human beings, if we lead with a message that is quite high in warmth rather than competence, then actually people will engage with that more, and it then helps us to then process that higher competence message, as in like the more detailed stuff. It helps us process that a lot easier. But in business, in B2B, we can go much more into the task of, right, this is the information they need to know. We need to give them all the information so they can make their proper decision. And actually, if we just kind of like chunk that down a bit, think about how we can bring in some little influential points, like a little bit of social proof from a company or somebody else who's very similar to the audience that you're communicating to, can make that much more impactful than just general social proof. Like there's just these little tweaks that can help make that much more engaging.
So can I get the following rubber stamped by a consumer psychologist about it? I've been wanting authority on this for a long time. I've been telling people, stop using big, long corporate blurb, industry jargon, filling up LinkedIn with this never-ending content. You're not adding line breaks in. You're not creating space. You're not putting questions at the right level. You're leading with. Hang on, what was you mentioned warmth? What was the other option, Babs? That was good.
Competence was the other I mentioned. Yeah.
So not warmth. I love that, Babs. So is that backed by you? I know there's not a one size fits all. I'm not trying to sell a blueprint or a course or anything like that. But overall, Babs, right? If businesses are at the moment writing massive long form and throwing it out on social, trying to give everyone everything, that's a mistake.
Yeah, you can broadly say, yeah, that is a mistake. Like, there are people who can happily sit and digest that and will, but even then, like, their automatic processing has to pick that up first before they'll even then start it. But no, just very, very broadly speaking, yes, most people, we need just to see things. We make a very quick judgment. And one thing that also in the B2B space that can really help is the use of imagery. Like just iconography, anything like that can make a massive impact, because our brains process images far quicker than an equivalent word. It's called the image superiority effect, and it's been well researched. So like, yes, you've got points to make, but if we could just back that up with a congruent image, it just makes something far easier just to process and to stick with.
Babs, I am going to let you leave eventually, but I just want to come to the thing. You've opened up a can there, actually.
Sorry.
I've seen a statistic online, or a fact, by someone far more clever than me, that said that the human brain processes images 60,000 times faster than words. And then it clicked for me, and this light bulb came, and I thought, aha, this makes sense, because a lot of the high profile, key people of influence, these company owners with big personal brands, you see on LinkedIn all of the time, post PDF carousels of their process, the customer journey. It's easy to go from A to B. And so this is not just looking sexy on social and creating something that's engaging. It's literally tapping into consumer psychology. Yeah,
exactly that. Yeah. And even like when you see something, because I've definitely, I see creators, and I've created things for people as well, like to put the PDF carousels together, and definitely you have far better engagement rates, and you have so many more downloads, anything like that. So all engagement metrics when you're presenting things in a broken down journey. And it's something like when you look into app development, when you look into the old faithful that any behavioral scientist, any consumer psychologist always cites, is something like Duolingo, where they have this they've gamified learning. I hate these buzzwords, just so you know, just as a side note, like gamification or what have you. Sorry, there should be a bingo card out there for this, shouldn't there? But it is ultimately what it is. But like the psychological principle behind that is this principle of chunking things down into smaller steps, and also to only show people like what they need to see in that moment, and just give them a hint of what's coming next. And so you just keep them moving through that way, rather than give them absolutely everything all at once. It just keeps them going through. And there was a big thing a few years ago about reducing the number of clicks on stuff. So like, this isn't necessarily social, but any kind of like digital products, there was a big thing, or like any customer journey on e-commerce sites, for example, there was a big thing about reducing the number of clicks. Everything's got to be easy, frictionless, the minimal number of clicks. yes, to a point, but not, it's not the hard and fast rule. And actually sometimes having more clicks in certain points of a customer journey can keep them more engaged, and then reducing the number of clicks down at like key decision points can be the thing that is a much better strategy than just focusing solely on, we've got to just have minimal clicks. And the same for a piece of content like a carousel. Some people think, like, have the fewest number of slides in there, but actually if you're telling a story and process influency, if you're making 1 point per slide, and if you've got something visual to show, like a journey through, people don't mind clicking. People are quite happy to click through, and it can keep them more engaged with that post for longer as well. So there's no perfect rule, and this is why it's just good to test all these things, because sometimes we need to speed people up, sometimes we need to slow them down to encourage that processing, and that helps to just keep them engaged and much more sticky along the way.
Perhaps we could go on and on and on and on.
Sorry, I did warn you.
I could honestly talk to you about this for hours, and I'm sure our audiences have found this an absolutely fascinating episode. Thank you. I must get you on for round 2 at some stage. And you've kind of moved into it now, so I'm really intrigued. How can people do business with you? Where can they connect with you? How can they get more of Babs?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. My name is Babs Crane. It's one of those quite memorable ones, so I don't think people forget it too easily. Also, you can email me directly. So I've got I've got a consultancy called Mind the Humans. So my email address for that is babs@mindthehumans.com. And I will gladly speak to anybody about consumer psychology, because obviously I find it fascinating, but also it's just hugely beneficial. So if anyone wants to get a geeky opinion on something, then please email me or reach me on LinkedIn.
Amazing, Babs. Thank you so much for your time and wisdom today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, no, thank you. It's been great.
And thank you so much to everyone watching this live, watching this back, listening to this back. Fascinated to hear your thoughts, feelings, and reflections on this episode. Hey, why not leave a comment and tag Babs in on the comments, and I'm sure that we'll get back to you as soon as we can, and help you when it comes to your consumer psychology, especially when it comes to that fascinating, ever-changing world of social media. Thanks, as always, folks, for tuning into an episode of Coffee with Chris. Thanks to our charity partners and our sponsors, and I'll see you this time next week for another one. Thank you.